So, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we have come a long way in this discussion on loss and damage. The conversation on loss and damage goes way back to the Warsaw and Lima COPs and resulted in the creation of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage back in 2013, and also the creation of the Santiago Network to finalize the program on loss and damage. It took almost 10 years before the work program of the Santiago Network culminated in the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27 in Egypt. And this was a major milestone, particularly for our continent, Africa, which, as you know, incurs massive costs from the impacts of climate change, which also inhibits the ability of the continent to invest in adaptation and building resilience to climate change. Now, to understand how we have come, how far we have come, but secondly also what is going to happen as a result of the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund, we have a distinguished panel of scientists, practitioners, but also senior policymakers who are going to give us their perspectives on the operation of this fund. Before we start the technical discussions, I would like to invite our panelists who are doing the official opening, starting with Mr. Vincent Opara, who is the head of Disaster Risk Reduction and Management in the Africa Union NEPAD agency, to give us the opening remarks on behalf of Her Excellency Dr. Nardos Thomas, the CEO of NEPAD. Please say you have the floor.
Good morning, colleagues. I'm here on behalf of my Chief Executive Officer, Madam Nardos Thomas, to give an opening statement. Before I do so, I would like to recognize the Executive Secretary of ECA, His Excellency Clever Katete. Good morning, sir. And also the chair of the Africa Group of Negotiators, Mr. Shetima, and also the colleagues from Afrexim Bank, WMO, and PACJA. I greet you all. Excellencies, distinguished guests, it is an honor to welcome all of you at this important event. Before I proceed, I would like to appreciate the host country, the United Arab Emirates, for the warm welcome extended to all of us since arrival. The excellent organization of COP28 in this beautiful city of Dubai is exemplary and commendable. As we gather here in a relaxed ambience of Expo City in Dubai, we need to recognize that Africa is facing a perfect storm of the 4 Cs. That is climate change, conflict, COVID-19 induced economic stress, and the rising cost of food and fuel. This storm is pushing millions of the poorest and most vulnerable towards food and nutrition insecurity. On one hand, these phenomena are reversing Africa's progress towards achieving the commitments of the Malabo Declaration, including zero hunger by 2025, as well as attainment of the SDGs by 2030 and the Agenda 2063. On the other hand, rising food and fuel costs, climate disasters, and post-pandemic economic stress, a recipe for disaster. Excellencies, in some of the intervention by our Chief Executive Officer, she's always underscored the importance of peace in nation building. And we know that there can be no development without peace and no peace without development. I think that peace and stability in the continent would depend on how well we manage and mitigate the 4 Cs. Managing and mitigating this phenomenon, among other things, will determine how best the continent of Africa and the rest of the world progress in all their economic goals. Unfortunately, for so long, Africa has been at the wrong end of international climate finance. The continent's climate financing needs is estimated at $2.5 trillion between 2020 and 2030, which averages $250 billion per year. However, only 12% of the total annual climate finance flows into Africa. However, the establishment of Loss and Damage Fund in 2023 presents a renewed hope and invigorated efforts by the developed countries to support developing countries in coping with the irreversible impacts of climate change and aid in the recovery of affected communities. Therefore, as the development arm of the African Union, AUDA-NEPAD interventions are geared towards advancing Africa's sustainable development goals through knowledge dissemination and collaboration. In 2013, AUDA established a climate fund that focuses on climate change adaptation and mitigation projects. And at the end of that project, 22 projects were implemented in 17 African countries, focusing on mainstreaming climate change adaptation in national agriculture investment plans, and also a few friendly solar dryers for fishing communities. We built storage facilities, and others were geared towards minimizing post-harvest loss. And also we had projects on afforestation. In addition, we have ongoing projects on gender climate adaptation, which is focused on capacity building among the smallholder farmers. As of date, we already capacitated over 2,000 smallholder farmers on how to cope with the harsh realities of climate change. In addition, the restoration of over 300 million hectares of land has been achieved through the NEPAD-led African Forest Landscape and Ecosystem Restoration Project. Excellencies, we've been hearing commitments and pledges for the last 2 days, in one of the sessions that was led by AUDA-NEPAD in conjunction with AGRA and the Green Climate Fund, GCF announced about $100 million to support 7 AU member states in their efforts to build resilient food systems, while acknowledging that about $3 trillion is required to implement the NDCs submitted by our member states. The funding announced by GCF exemplifies dedication to actionable solutions. Furthermore, we at AUDA are collaborating with other partners to secure contributions in terms of financial support, technical expertise, capacity building programs, and sustainable investment, crucial for empowering African nations to implement effective climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. In this light, we are ready to support member states in assessing the loss and damage fund. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Mr. Opar, on behalf of AUDA-NEPAD. Now, as I said in the beginning, to date, the only model-based method of assessing loss and damage was in fact developed at the UN Economic Commission back in 2013. And it is that model which was influential in the establishment of the also international mechanism on loss and damage. The UN Economic Commission continues to invest in updating that model to ensure that it becomes responsive to contemporary conditions and challenges. But we are honored to have here the Executive Secretary and Under-Secretary of the UN Economic Commission, Mr. Claver Gatete, to talk about our perception of loss and damage and how the ECA will respond to the establishment of the fund. Mr. Gatete, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me from the back? Yeah, dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a pleasure for us to be able to meet here at this time. Last year, actually beginning of this year, there was a study that was initiated by the G20. And they were looking at the resources that would finance the SDGs, but also the climate. And they estimated that 3 trillion would be needed up to 2030 that would finance the entire climate. And out of that, that would finance the climate and SDGs. But out of that, we needed 1.8 trillion. Now, this money is divided into so many different areas. It's an adaptation, mitigation, resilient, but now loss and damage, which is most critical. In as much as we mitigate, but there are already the damage that is happening right now. And that's why we needed this fund. And here we are very, very happy that at least last year in the COP27, they established the fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, which concluded really the entire discussion that is close to almost 3 decades. The COP28 has started positively with the adoption of the recommendation of the Transitional Committee on Loss and Damage. The fund, with now funding pledges amounting to 656 million as of yesterday, is really very encouraging. It marks the beginning of a very important era on our efforts to address climate change and its impacts. We are aware that there is so much work to be done to make the fund operational, but we are optimistic that before the end of this COP28, we'll have agreed upon the necessary arrangements to make the fund operational and receive more pledges to make it financially viable. Moreover, we are confident that these pledges will be promptly translated into actual payments to the fund and make it usable by the member countries. Many projections show that the economic costs of climate change in developing countries will reach between 290 billion and 580 billion annually by the year 2030. And this, of course, calls for a lot of resources to be invested, especially for the Loss and Damage Fund. Thus, there is a need for rapidly scaling up of the Loss and Damage Fund, including diversification of funding sources and domestic resource mobilization. Not all the money will come from outside, but also it has to come from our own resources. I understand the importance of accurate information in decision-making regarding the fund allocation. Our institution, the ECA, currently working on upgrading the model-based methodology that was initially developed in 2013, as mentioned by the Master of Ceremony. Additionally, we are contributing to further advancements in attribution science to enhance the accuracy of loss and damage assessments. These efforts are crucial for the successful operationalization of the fund. My institution remains committed to supporting African member states to build capacity so they can fully benefit from the operationalization of the fund. We stand committed to supporting the African group of negotiators in their work on loss and damage. We'll work with member states to build their capacity and improve their access to the fund, including supporting initiatives for resilience building, rehabilitation, and reconstruction of the infrastructure of the ecosystem. This will help us in terms of preventing, but at the same time, supporting the countries, especially those island states, to make sure that they can deal with the issues of climate change. I just didn't want to take much of the time. I wanted just to stop here and indicate the importance of the Loss and Damage Fund, which we are going to work together to make sure that countries access it. Having a fund in itself is very good, but if you cannot access the resources, it won't give you much. And that's why we need to quickly, now that we have a methodology, now that we have a formula, to make sure that we can give the capacity to the countries that can start now accessing the resources. We hope that the pledges is going to be translated into the actual resources in the fund and agreeing on the methodology for the countries to access it. I didn't want to take much of your time, but I wanted just to express the importance of this fund and how we can work together to make it operational. I thank you very much for your kind attention and wish you fruitful deliberation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, who unfortunately has another urgent commitment and cannot stay with us through the discussion. However, we are honored. The ES talked about the initiation, the operational of the process of operationalizing the fund through the pledges that have been made, which by yesterday amounted to $655 million. But he also talked about the importance of putting together modalities for accessing and disbursing the funds that would be, well, the modalities, firstly, of ensuring that funds the fund is resourced, but how we will access and disburse those funds. We are fortunate to have with us the chair of the Africa Group of Negotiators, who are leading the negotiations, the African continent, in negotiating precisely how those questions are going to be answered. The chair of the Africa Group of Negotiators, Mr. Shitima, also has other important engagements. So I would like to ask him to give us his statement, and then we can release him so we can have a discussion following that statement. But before I give the floor to him, also to say that yesterday, the chair facilitated a meeting between the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, as well as the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment, AMCEN, and the UN Secretary General to reflect on the launch of the fund and the pledges that have been made to the fund and how this COP could actually respond to those developments. So, Chair, if you could just give us some updates on where we are going with the fund during this COP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and good morning, colleagues. Yeah, on the fund, maybe just to agree with the Executive Director's assessment that it's a very huge achievement. This is something that we've been fighting for over 30 years. You have two arms of addressing climate change. You have mitigation on one side, you have adaptation on the other. But when both fail, and we know the trajectory on which we are, that's the likely possibility, you need how to address loss and damage. Loss and damage is basically what happens beyond adaptation. When a city is wiped out, for example, because of an extreme climate event like we had in, is it Libya a few months ago, over 20,000 people are killed. You cannot adapt to that, and that's where loss and damage is required. Now, the reason we needed a different fund is because the financial architecture that we have at the moment is simply not fit for purpose. It cannot respond to such sudden and extreme events, which will require you to have the funding almost immediately. You'd have to write proposals, you have to submit proposals, they have to be reviewed and then respond to you, and that simply is not the case. We have made progress in just the last 10 years, like James indicated. We have put the governance institution in place, that's the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, that's a governance. We have also put in place the technical aspect, the technical arm to provide support in terms of capacity building, knowledge exchange, and all that. That's the Santiago network on loss and damage. So the network is more of a technical nature to provide the support to countries. We have almost finalized on that. I'll come and touch on it. And the last jigsaw in the puzzle, if you like, was the fund, which is established in 2022 in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 and now operationalized at COP28. But it hasn't just been operationalized, it has also been capitalized because, like everyone has indicated, funding has started to flow in that fund. Yes, we are elated as negotiators that we have over 600 million pledged immediately into the fund, but we are also cautious. First of all, the required resources are in billions and not millions. And so far, we are only talking of 600 million. We are not even hitting a billion. So that means that there is more that is required to be put into that fund. The other caution that we have, and which we are looking at quite closely, is those who followed the announcements. Some of the countries who were making pledges were mentioning other funds, a climate resilience fund, solidarity. There has been discussions. There are countries who are not comfortable with calling this fund a loss and damage fund, and they are still pushing to see if there can be a name change. These are things that we are opposed to because the agreement that was reached, the recommendation that was reached by the Transitional Committee, which was very late. Remember, they had 4 sessions. The Transitional Committee that was established at COP27 to work out these modalities were given 4 meetings to conclude their work. They couldn't conclude their work in 4 meetings. The 4th meeting was in Aswan, Egypt. It wasn't conclusive. So the COP28 president gave them an extra slot. Basically, the UAE funded an extra slot for them to conclude work, and that meeting was held in Abu Dhabi on the 3rd and 4th November, just before the commencement of the COP. That's where the package was agreed. So the package which was agreed was very delicate, and we don't want to reopen that. Even just trying to change the name basically reopens that package. Remember, we are not comfortable with the World Bank to start with as a window and all that. So any attempt at reopening that could unravel everything, which is why the COP presidency decided to have that decision adopted at the opening plenary. It's unprecedented. Immediately, he opened the conference towards the end of adopting of that. He called for the adoption of that report and gathered so that that decision is done and packed. But there are still issues to be worried about. First of all, we need to put a board in place because some of the decisions that have to be made require a board. So the COP28 president is calling for the nomination of members to the board so that before we conclude this COP, you have the board in place who have to make governance decisions to make it functional. So the fund is established, yes. The fund is operationalized, yes. And the fund is capitalized. you required at least $200 million to have it capitalized by the World Bank standards. So it is capitalized, but the fund is not functional. To make the fund functional, you need a board in place, and that's why constituting a board is important. And from the African group, we were the first to nominate our members to sit on the transitional committee last year, and we intend to be the first to nominate board members before we leave here, so that we have people who have to make now governance decisions to make this fund functional. Now, I've seen on the questions that, so what, when we put this fund in place, does it mean that now we are comfortable, we can relax on adaptation, we can relax on mitigation? That is not the case. This fund is only an emergency response that has to ensure that we are able to address these emergencies when they occur. But we need to do more on mitigation, because we have to solve the root cause of the problem. We need to do more on adaptation, so that only the residual impacts that we can't deal with through mitigation and adaptation are what we relate to the fund. Maybe my last point would be on the name. There are countries that are not comfortable with loss and damage, because according to their jurisdictions, they have made policy announcements already that they cannot pay for reparations. That is, they cannot pay for compensation on climate change. And so if the name remains as it is, they would have difficulties to access funding from their parliaments or Congress or whatever they call their legal parts. And they are they're coming up with suggestions of names. For example, a solidarity fund. And we are totally opposed to that. A solidarity fund has connotations of arms. It means they are just providing solidarity for you out of sympathy. And that is not the case with loss and damage. We are not asking for arms, and this fund is not out of sympathy. It is a responsibility as a provision under the convention. You've caused the damage, and you are supposed to help the countries. There were other suggestions, for example, to name the fund as a climate resilience fund. That also is different. You are moving away. We know adaptation has resources that address that, and we don't want to mix that. Others went to the extreme of suggesting that we name this fund after some of our fallen heroes within the climate change process. I think most of you may know that we lost one of our stalwarts from Bangladesh, Mr. Salim Haq, and a number of people had suggestions that maybe we name this fund under that. But that's not how we do things in this process. We have a lot of fallen heroes who have, what criteria are you going to use to identify which of the fallen heroes you name a particular fund on? So we are sticking to loss and damage as originally designed. And one thing we have said is, if there are things that need to be done, some of those are operational. Let the board come and deal with some of those issues that are operational. But let's make the fund functional and ensure that it is readily available to provide the support to needed countries. Now, just to clarify one point. Yes, all of us didn't want the World Bank as a trustee for this fund. I will have to be honest on that, because countries have experience with the World Bank. And in my opening remarks, I said the funds, including the World Bank, are not fit for purpose to respond to loss and damage. But we had to settle for this because this fund needs to be functional immediately. And to make a fund functional immediately, you cannot start from the scratch. Those who are familiar with the GCF, it took us not less than 3-4 years to have the GCF become functional. Now, what we have done with entrusting the World Bank is to put a lot of caveats. This fund is going to be independent. It is going to have an independent board. All the rules and procedures they are going to be following are independent, and we have put time frames. It's a transitional period of 4 years. We need to be happy that the World Bank is executing this fund according to our terms. Otherwise, there is a clause that we can revert back and get to have an independent fund. So starting this fund as a window under the World Bank was to ensure that we follow the guidance we are given by our policymakers that this fund needs to be up and running almost immediately. There was no other way that you could do it and ensure that the fund is up and running. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shitima, the chair of the Africa Group of Negotiators. So Mr. Shitima has pointed out several important issues in the negotiations that are going on, starting, of course, with the very significant fact that the fund is operational and also now on its way to getting resourced. But the big questions are the putting in place the finalization of the governance arrangements. It's also pointed out that the location of the fund in the World Bank, while it could be contentious in certain contexts, is also a strategic decision to get the fund immediately operational, since the requirement was in fact that if the fund got pledges of $200 million, it becomes operational. Now that we're at $600 million, it is possible that the fund can begin to operate within the World Bank, but with conditionalities which include a board that is independent of the bank, as well as independent operational and access modalities. Very important considerations. But I think for us here also it is important that we understand that the Africa Group of Negotiators is also looking at us for support in terms of responding to the issues around the definitions of loss and damage. What is it that we are assessing? How are we assessing it? And how can we develop a standardized model that is applicable to all of us as a continent, especially given the urgency of the question for us. So thank you very much once again, Chair. We are aware that the negotiations are ongoing and you are welcome to live or to participate in the panel as your time permits. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to have a conversation with our distinguished panel, which I had introduced earlier, but I will reintroduce. We have a representative from a program which is looking at accelerating the impacts of climate change research in Africa, including responses to the impacts of climate change. We have the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We have a representative of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and we have a representative of the Afrexim Bank, Africa Import and Export Bank, constitute our panel to discuss several questions that can help us to concretize our support to the African positions, but also our general understanding of loss and damage. The panel is going to be discussing 5 questions. The first question is, what is unique about loss and damage funds, and how is it different from other existing climate funds? The chair already indicated, for instance, some of the debates around naming the fund, whether in fact the funds that are being put into this fund are new and additional, or whether they are continuations of existing forms of support. So that's a very important question that we are going to be discussing. Secondly, we are also going to be discussing the question of how could the history of Africa not benefiting significantly from other climate finance be mitigated through this loss and damage fund. Thirdly, how can the adoption of good governance instruments ensure equitable distribution of the loss and damage funds? The fourth question for our panel is, how can the issues of strict financial obligation versus voluntary contributions by developed countries be navigated? Again, this is a question that confronts many of the provisions of the Paris Agreement, including provisions around, for instance, the carbon markets. How do we balance voluntary against commitments, voluntary commitments against obligatory commitments, sorry. The final question which the panel is going to be discussing is the establishment of the loss and damage funds should not be a license to cause more damage. So how can loss and damage itself be minimized? In other words, how can we build resilience of systems in order to reduce loss and damage? So I will ask the panel in the order in which they are seated to just give us their reflections on these questions in no particular order. And then we can have a general conversation with the audience. So starting with you, Dr. Dawit Solomon, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, James. So I'm coming from the consultative group of international agricultural research and formerly managing climate change, agriculture, and food security mostly in Eastern and Southern Africa. So I'll look at this more from the agriculture and food security perspective. So for us, for a long time, in private conversations, major reports, including the State of the Climate Report for Africa, as well as discussions with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, the African Climate Policy Center, countries and all that. There were two critical questions that we have been grappling with. The first one is early warning system for all Africans, so that at least Africans are aware of what is coming. And the second thing is loss and damage. I think we have been put this a number of reports, including the State of the Climate, the CCCDA outcome reports, and in all other areas. So for us really to see that, the Emirati Declaration has put loss and damage as really one of the most important research area that need to be addressed, along with resilience, adaptation, and synergies with mitigation is very, very important, and it's a big achievement. And the resource behind it is also important. So let me give you a quick perspective why we are really looking at it from the agriculture perspective. If you look at an estimated damage, in terms of monetary resource, 3.8 trillion worth of crop and livestock production has been lost due to climate-related disaster over the last 30 years. This is a significant amount of it. Although the majority of it, and it's the Asian continent as well as the African continent which faced most of this thing. But if you look at it in the past, the focus on agriculture and consideration when it comes to loss and damage was minimal. But this declaration put into perspective is that, yes, we need to consider agriculture, and yes, we need to consider, the loss that is happening around agriculture. Agri-food system, all the way from production, processing, and transportation is critical and really supporting Africa. It is the backbone of the economy. And the fact that it is going to be backed now and it is integrated into the loss and damage is very, very important. The second and the most important thing is a sort of an agreement on both the non-economic and economic loss and damage. I think the agreement on the methodologies, even if there's a lot needs to be put into that and concretized as a thing. Going back to the fund quickly, what is important is pledges are already being played. And often we see a lot of pledge, but I think taking that pledge and making sure that the resource is available is, I think, the first step. For us, the second and the most important thing, if you see, is accessing loss and damage resource. So who is accessing this? National governments. But then what happens beyond that? How do we cascade that resource, which is going to be accessed by national governments, and when extreme events such as drought, water stress, as well as flash floods are happening at the community level, considering, for example, what happened recently in the Greater Horn of Africa, northern Kenya, what happened in eastern Ethiopia, what happened in southern Ethiopia, Somalia, and beyond that. So how does this resource not only be accessed by national governments, but also becomes an integral part of the preparedness as well as early action to make sure that local communities are benefiting from this is critical. So I think it is not only, although the agriculture sector is integrated into this, and we're really happy about it, that smallholder farmers, agro-pastoralists, and marginalized pastoralist communities can benefit from this. How are the national governments going to access this? And how are they going to cascade this into the communities so that smallholder farmers and livestock keepers are going to benefit from it is also a critical component. So we will continue to push for this thing, and we'll continue to make the case for those who are vulnerable and work in this area. I think there is a need to further refine the methodology, and we'll continue to work with the African Climate Policy Center, UNECA, and other relevant actors in this. So it is our sincere hope that the pledge will not remain as a pledge, they will be concretized, but also countries when the national governments will take this thing and make sure that the communities which are actually affected by that will benefit from it. And I'll leave it at this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solomon, for those reflections. I think it is quite significant that Dr. Solomon's comments are focusing only on the agriculture sector, which for Africa is the most critical and most vulnerable to climate impacts. But also the amount of damages, quantified damages, is very massive and way, way beyond the pledges that we have received so far. I think the figure you quoted was $3.8 trillion in damages to climate change. That is significant. So far, we have only 600 billion, and this is for the whole world. So now, as you are aware, the work of the whole framework on climate change is undergirded by research, scientific information, which is generated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is constituted into several working groups. One of the most important in terms of loss and damage is, in fact, Working Group 2. Working Group 2 focuses on impacts, including assessments of vulnerabilities, socioeconomic, and other impacts of climate change. We are very honored to have here on our panel Dr. Cromwell Lukonto, my brother, who is the Vice Chair of the IPCC Working Group on Impacts, which is going to be taking a lead on understanding loss and damage. Your reflections, Dr. Cromwell.
Thank you very much, James. I hope I'm heard. Right. I'm Cromwell Lukorito. I come from Kenya, working for the University of Nairobi. I'm a climate scientist with special interest in applications in agriculture and food systems. And recently, in the 7th assessment cycle, I was elected as a vice chair to the Working Group 2 on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, where I believe this whole subject of loss and damage rests squarely because of the nature of Africa's vulnerability to the adverse impacts of climate change, where against a backdrop of our limited capacities, we have a lot of unadapted for climate risk, which indeed puts us at a higher level of loss and damage. If we look at the continent in entirety, looking at the mainland Africa, looking at our small island developing states, which in the majority of cases we tend to overlook when we are pushing even the AGN's agenda. So mine, coming from the IPCC window, is all about knowledge products. The scientific knowledge products are what we require even to drive this access of the loss and damage fund. Remember, the AGN chair has been categorical that loss and damage is being looked at in the context of that unadapted for risk. For us in Africa, do we understand that portion of the risk which will form a basis for our case? That has been my concern for a couple of years now, because I saw this fund coming to be operationalized. And the question I've been putting across is that are we prepared for these funds? That's a question I put to us, and I'm happy that the UN ECA already has a methodology. What is ECA doing with that resource? Why has indeed cascaded down to the member countries of Africa? Where are Africa's think tanks? I'm happy IGRA as a support system is here. Where are our universities? Where is research for Africa to really cascade that methodology across our nations so that we can be in a position to, one, even quantify the very impact from historical perspectives? That is totally lacking. That is why even at the IPCC level, we are being presented as Africa from a coloration of grayness. You know, grayness signifies emptiness. It signifies gaps. Is that correct for Africa? The answer is no. We have a lot of resources. Where are the documenters of these resources? The universities, the research institutions, where are you? That's my challenge I put to us. We need to have Africa's case properly packaged in the global arena. Recently, we are grappling with a special report on climate change and cities, the scoping phase. I put out a call after doing a rapid a capacity enhancement and awareness creation in the 5 sub-regions of Africa with the support of the African group of negotiators, expert support, the Agnes, and I'm happy, James, that we are beginning to get very positive feedback from Africa scientists. And I want to encourage us. I received about 59 responses to the expression of interest to participate in the scoping event for the special report on climate change and cities. I wish to implore upon us as Africa to take the same initiative and do the same for the loss and damage, because it is not going to be a walk in the park, as it has been alluded to. We have to put up a strong case for us to be able to unlock these loss and damage finances. So James, I throw the challenge to you as an institution, the UN ECA. Can you work with Africa's think tanks together with other colleagues in the Bureau so that we can have a clear way on how we are going to fast track that a capacity enhancement for the continent so that we can unlock these resources? Africa is noted as the most vulnerable continent globally. Then this, I must say, is Africa's fund, if you allowed me to say so. I would look at it as an Africa's fund, and therefore what we require is a strategy to unlock these particular financing mechanisms. I want to agree with my colleague all about anticipatory capacity of a climate risk, which calls for investment, especially in the climate information services, in our national weather services across Africa, in our modeling capabilities, in our early warning systems, so that we can be on top of things, so that we can anticipate and therefore be able to prepare. We are not going to be there reacting to the impacts. No. We want to, as much as possible, build our capacities to respond to the adverse impacts of climate change. So this is an opportunity for us as a continent, and how we navigate this space will depend on how quickly we come together with a strategy on how we develop ourselves, positioning ourselves also to a level where we are putting our case clearly and in a manner that resonates with the level of impact, with the level of vulnerability that we go through. So thank you very much, James. I pass the mic to my colleague. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Lukorito, for those observations and comments. But significantly, Dr. Lukorito, like Dr. Solomon before him, has thrown out this challenge of what is it that we can contribute towards the further development of this fund, but particularly to ensure that if we understand that this is an Africa fund, how are we ourselves going to be prepared to access the fund? I think he also mentions something that is very significant, which is the contribution of African climate science to understanding the challenge. Perhaps just by way of a background, we all know that the IPCC does not carry out any research. Instead, the IPCC compiles its views and perspectives on the basis of published research across the globe. We carried out an assessment recently, and we observed that, in fact, the IPCC depends particularly for the climate science component on research that is published in 5 journals, 5 international journals. The contribution of African science, of published African science in those 5 journals is only about 6%, which is an improvement from assessment report 4, where it was about 4%. So from 4 to 6%. So what this means is we know that we are carrying out significant research on the continent, but we are not getting that research published in those spaces which are influential in constructing the climate change and development narrative. So the question, and particularly for our colleagues in academia, is how do we actually create spaces which can influence the international, the global narrative based on the work that is being done in our continent. So thank you very much, Dr. Cromwell. But the other question that was asked by both Drs. Cromwell and Dr. Solomon is that most of our response to climate change is at the level of the national government. What happens beyond the government? What happens beyond the state? How do we understand, how do we grapple with climate change beyond the government? And so we are fortunate to have with us on the panel a representative of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, which is an alliance, the biggest alliance of civil society working on climate change. My big brother, young brother actually, Charles A. Mwangi from PACJA. If you could please just share with us the reflections from a civil society perspective on all of these questions about the operationalization of the fund. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murobezi, and thank you for having us in this panel. Like you indicated, I work for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance as the head of programs and research, and we are basically one of the largest civil society organizations pushing for climate justice in the continent, present in 51 countries in Africa. But allow me, James, to be so open, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, but again, I don't want to employ diplomacy in this conversation. And I want to begin by saying this conversation, lost and damaged, to put it in simple words, was actually lost and damaged, probably in Paris, when we were passing and, of course, signing the Paris Agreement. You know, we went to Paris, or in those conversations, of course, thinking that we are pushing for loss and damage to be taken so seriously, because loss and damage and facility that comes with the same is supposed to support countries to be able, of course, to support itself, you know, especially because of the impacts that are beyond our capacity to adapt. And of course, the big question that comes on board is, do we even have enough resources, you know, for adaptation in the first place? The gap as we stand is about $340 billion per year up to 2030, where we are talking about doubling of the 20 billion available to about 40. But going back to the conversation in 2015, if you look at the decision CP, I think paragraph 51, CP 21, paragraph 51, you know, parties made it very clear that you cannot hold any country responsible for loss and damage. And therefore, the question of reparation really was kept at bay. But we are really hoping that that would be a critical conversation. That is what would have made sense really for the continent. In my view, we are systematically losing the war on loss and damage. Think about what has been happening around here and what people are celebrating. 600 million pledge. Note, pledge. It's not money that has been availed. Now think about it this way, and I want to be very open. The US president very recently was seeking approval from Congress of more than 100 billion US dollars to support Ukraine, but also to support US, not US, but Israel, in the war against Hamas. Simply because they felt that Ukraine is endangered, probably Israel, is also endangered, and therefore there was urgent need to save humanity, to save citizens of those two countries because of this threat, from Hamas and the others. 100 billion, one country, one sitting. But we are gathered here, over 200 countries, and together we have pledged 600 million US dollars for countries, 54 countries in Africa, others in Asia Pacific, others in the Caribbean, but we expected to sit here and clap and say that we're making progress. I want to give you a small analogy. I come from a very typical African village. And back in the years, we used to go to weddings uninvited, and especially small children. The young children would actually be majority in such kind of wedding. But because we would not be taken to the high table where juices and sodas are, we would be taken to one corner, and they would give us very low quality juice, and we'd be told, hi, these are your sodas, these are your juices, and we take it, celebrating. We have taken juice in that particular wedding. But we were being moved from the high table to avoid distraction. That is the exact situation we're experiencing in this COP. 600 million pledge. We expected to clap when one single country is capable of contributing 100 billion to finance war in two countries. That is the situation. And I want to say this, that until we are able to appreciate that climate change is a reality and it is really affecting so many people. When we're coming here, in Kenya, we experienced a very, very serious flood. In fact, I also have a very close friend of mine who works for Kenya Revenue Authority. And that is when I came to terms with the reality that for sure these issues are very, very close to us. And I want to say this, until we have that political goodwill, until countries appreciate that we are in the same ship, only that some of us are in the higher deck, and others are in the lower deck, but the ship is actually sinking, and probably we are all going to go down, we are not going to make a lot of sense in this conversation. Now, last year there was that decision that we passed at COP28 in Sharm el-Sheikh, that we have the facility established. Fine, we clapped. But you see, we continued watering that down that particular conversation, and I remember in SB in Germany, during the SB conversations, there was the language of how do we have this fund becoming voluntary, and philanthropies can actually be able to put some money there, and we can now start thinking about issues of insurance in the same particular fund, and now it's becoming an issue of even suggestions about changing the name. Solidarity Fund. We are starting in solidarity with these poor Africans and these poor Caribbeans and people from the Asia because of the issues that are experiencing, but we are not responsible for the same. I think that notion is not right, but again, the other way we are losing it. Well, we understand, of course, arguably, the World Bank probably have the structures to, hold funds. But what experience do we have with the World Bank in terms of how money can actually be able to flow to the communities that are mostly affected? Now, we have a timeline of 4 years, meaning the first country to access this money will probably access in 4 years. And that is if, only if, the World Bank accepts probably the conditionalities, they are going to come up in the issue of coming up with another board and so on and so forth. Suppose World Bank comes back and says, we are not capable of handling this. We don't feel that these particular measures, these particular protocols that are being established, we don't feel comfortable. It means we go back to the drawing board. But are the people in Malawi, those who are dying from cyclones, are those people dying in Kenya from floods, are those people sinking, in the Pacific, going to wait for another 4 years until these particular structures are put in place? So the thing is, let's have political will, and let us avail resources because they are there for us to be able to really address this issue with the magnitude and the seriousness it deserves. 600 million is an insult, should not be mentioned anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Charles, for those reflections representing the views of civil society, and particularly for pointing out the need to link loss and damage with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is a major issue in the negotiations, but also the whole questions of reparations, which, as you heard from the chair, is one of the issues that have actually been shelved or bracketed, to use the language of the negotiations. But you also bring in the important question of how can we get sufficient political will across the globe to address this question in a comprehensive, holistic manner. And you question the adequacy of the 600 million, which are the sum total of the initial pledges that have been made into the fund. But if we put aside for a moment, if that is possible, this question of pledges that are coming from all over the place and begin to think about whether in fact it is feasible for us to design other mechanisms to innovate and finance loss and damage from other mechanisms, would there actually be opportunities for the continent to utilize, for instance, its vast resources that we've boast about to contribute towards how we can, address loss and damage in our systems? And to help us answer that question, we have a representative of an African institution, the Africa Export and Import Bank, Afreximbank, my colleague and brother Edmund Bobo, who is the ESG, which is a very important topic for us, environment, social governance, and also senior management in Afreximbank. Please, if you can reflect on these questions from the perspective of an African financial institution. Thank you.
Thank you, James. I'll quickly start by thanking the organizers of this event for finding it worthy to invite Afreximbank to be part of this panel. Afreximbank, or the African Export-Import Bank, is a multilateral development bank that has membership from 52 Africa countries presently. And in terms of areas of operations, we are charged with the mandate to promote intra and extra-Africa trade, and importantly, promote the development of the African continent. We are based in Cairo, Egypt, and in terms of our interventions are spread across all countries in Africa. This topic is quite interesting, and I'll start by giving some preambles. And I'll be speaking more from the financing and development perspective, just to throw more light on how this is important to us as an institution. I'll start by mentioning that if you look at the continent of Africa today, statistics and data in terms of quantification of what the volume of financing that Africa needs to combat the issue of loss and damage in the continent is put about $400 billion today. And if you look at, in the last 10 years or more, there has been several commitments, particularly the $100 billion commitments to support the developing world to meet climate-related targets or pursue climate-related interventions in developing countries. Clearly, that has not been met. We note that at the COP27, one of the important decisions was the agreement to set up the Loss and Damage Fund, and follow up with the Transitional Committee. We came up with a report in terms of defining the modus operandi in terms of governance, eligibility criteria, funding, and replenishment arrangements in terms of, and also disbursement instruments to support the implementation of the fund. We view loss and damage as an existential risk to the continent of Africa. Previous speakers have alluded to the prevalence of climate-related disasters. We had the cyclone in Malawi, Mozambique, East Africa, and the Horn of Africa today have been suffering from the impact of the drought. We are seeing that manifesting in food security, food scarcity, impact on agriculture, and even loss of human lives. So in conceptualizing loss and damage, we look at it broadly from an economic perspective and non-economic loss and damage. The economic loss and damage, you can quantify it in monetary terms, but the non-economic damages, clearly you can't do anything about it in terms of these are human lives, these are source of livelihoods, farmlands, livestock that are impacted. If you look at the fund itself, from an African perspective, I think we should look at it from three major pillars. Firstly, we look at the demand side in terms of countries that will be accessing the fund, and we also look at the supply side arrangements or modalities to fund the loss and damage fund itself. Clearly, most of my colleagues here on the panel have mentioned the fact that the contributions so far is a scratch in the surface if you look at the quantum of financial resources that we need to drive climate-related interventions in the continent as it relates to loss and damage. The question is, what should Africa do differently to ensure that our experience with the loss and damage fund is not the same as other funds we have today? And I'll paint a quick picture of what happens practically. If you look at other funds that we see, there is funding, or there might be no funding. Then on the demand side, the criteria to access the funds are so stringent that African countries, particularly who are the worst hit in terms of the impact of climate change, struggle to access these funds. And from the perspective of supply, if you look at the methodology that has been advised by the Transitional Committee, they've talked about grants, concessional funds, loans rather, in terms of the three major instruments to fund the loss and damage fund. But the conversation should move from the fact that we cannot deny that in spite of Africa being the least contributor to carbon emissions vis-a-vis the impacts on climate change, Africa deserves some form of compensation. I'll use the word reparation to address and mitigate this impact as it spreads across various jurisdictions in the continent. On the other point, in terms of access to the fund, there are issues around eligibility, there are issues around assessment of damage, there are issues around structuring of grant requests or intervention requests to ensure that they meet the standards of the loss and damage fund. For an institution like Afreximbank, we will be focusing more in line with our mandate to support African countries to ensure that there's relevant advisory support to countries to ensure that projects or initiatives that are being put forward to access the fund are properly structured in a way that they are able to meet the eligibility criteria or the assessment requirements to access the fund. We see other opportunities in terms of intervention instruments to support early-stage projects. We have a project preparatory fund that has today a pipeline of about $2 billion to ensure that we support national governments, we support entities, subnational entities in the continent to prepare applications, to prepare projects to benefit from the fund. An important thing I want to mention is the role of critical stakeholders. If you look at a fund like this, one of the ways you can hold the fund, or Africa can hold the fund accountable, is to say that as a continent, every country in the continent must have a clearly defined focal point in terms of bringing on board key stakeholders, our climate justice and other NGOs, civil society organizations, and even leverage on existing government structures to access and identify projects. I want to mention that something peculiar about the loss and damage fund is that the beneficiaries of the fund are not in the cities in Africa. They are in what? Extreme locations. So the conversations around access to loss and damage should have a framework for project identification, should I say disaster identification, impact assessment that are clearly articulated such that they are able to meet these predefined criteria for access. Critical for Africa also is the issue of monitoring and evaluation. So we have funds today that are denied additional, should I say, disbursements because there is no clarity in terms of what the initial disbursements have been used for. Every country in Africa that plans to benefit from the fund must have clear-cut structures in terms of monitoring and evaluation to ensure that the disbursement of the funds are used for intended purposes, and even the civil society organizations can play a role in terms of advocacy in getting our developed partners or the developed world to see the need to increase the current volume of contributions. One of the questions that the moderation asked is, how do we strike a balance between voluntary contribution and mandatory contribution. I'll tell you that given the history of climate impact in Africa, it should be a 70-30 arrangement. I think there is opportunity for countries that pollute the world today to make it not just a pledge, but practically demonstrate their commitment to the success of this fund by ensuring that available financial resources are put forward to support countries. That aside, other countries, stakeholders that deem it necessary and believe in the objective of the fund can, on a voluntary basis, make contributions to the fund. But importantly, Africa needs to get its act together in terms of articulating what our needs are, ensuring that our needs or requests are properly structured to meet predefined criteria or requirements to access the fund. Then I want to also mention something very critical, is that a fund like this requires a value chain collaboration to make it a success. It is not a fund for governments. It is not a fund alone for private sector. It's a fund that has to bring all parties together. In short, all hands must be on deck to aggregate efforts to ensure that Africa takes the best in terms of advantage of the opportunity of this fund. Critical, the issue of replenishment, like I said, clearly, if you look at the gap, 600 million to about $400 billion, we've just not scratched the surface. So the continent needs to take deliberate steps to ensure that we are better positioned to take advantage of the fund. Then lastly, from the perspective of our Afrexim Bank, we've currently launched the Climate Adaptation Program, which is essentially designed to ensure that we support countries in terms of their climate resilience efforts and in ensuring that the impact of climate change on the continent, our people are mitigated as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edmund. I think it is really encouraging to note that we have an African institution which is looking at developing practical solutions to some of the questions that we are asking. So Edmund has informed us that Afrexim Bank, in fact, will be putting together facilities to offer advisory services to African stakeholders on accessing the loss and damage fund, depending on the access modalities that would have been developed. But also that the Afrexim Bank has put in place a pipeline of $2 billion for project preparation in order to address loss and damage. Also, the reference to the role of critical stakeholders and the need to have proper systems of targeting beneficiaries, particularly to ensure that marginalized and the most vulnerable are in fact the beneficiaries of that fund. So thank you very much once again, Edmund, for those comments, but also for enlightening us on the efforts of the Afrexim Bank in assisting the continent to respond to loss and damage. I'm informed by the organizers that we have a few minutes to interact with the panel if there are any questions or comments before we proceed to the closing remarks. So I don't know most people's names, so please forgive me if I point at you and request you to just make your intervention. So I'll start with the lady and I'll come to you, sir. I think we have a roving mic somewhere. Charles, if you can assist me to get a mic to people to speak to. Go ahead.
Okay, it's come. Thank you very much. I'm very proud and happy to be in this room just to even listen to what our colleagues in Africa who have the position to be in those rooms and what they are advancing and the thoughts. And I think this is great moment. It's something that personally and part of my work has been involved in trying to help advocate for this. Of course, disappointedly so from what Mithika said. I share a lot of the things that you shared. And I have two questions to the panelists. Is there any negotiation from where you sit that this fund will ever be accessible to civil society? So is there any opening on it closed that it has to go to the government, or are we still on the route to say that it is for all of us? Of course, it's not a lot of money. Secondly, I think from where I sit, we need to also frame the issue of loss and damage as a way to help our people to adapt and mitigate. I work in the sector of women's land rights. A lot of what has been lost and damaged is actually the land that women who live in poverty have been holding on to. So two things that we must be able to do is ensure that these resources and many other resources goes to the women so that they can revitalize their land and be able to rebuild their lands. And I think secondly, and I would say it is ultimate, and I know our African government are making steps, very painful, slow steps, is securing ownership and control of land by women. Women don't have the pleasure to actually protect the land if they know that they are not owning, which is less than 2%, less than 5% of women in Africa have control and ownership of land. I would really persuade you that we really need to ensure that there is justice in control and ownership of land in the continent to deal with the loss and damage that has happened, but to also avoid future damage on our land. I work for the Stand for Her Land campaign. I am the Global Advocacy Director.
And your name?
My name is Esther Mwaora Moiro.
Okay. Yeah, there's the gentleman in front here. Charles, if you can. While you are handing over the mic, I think I'm going to ask Edmund to respond to that question, because in fact, Edmund, you raised this issue of how do we understand non-quantifiable damages, like how do we understand changes in losses of land rights, of access to land, tenure issues and so on, regarding the climate impacts on those. So yes, sir.
Je remercie les panélistes pour leur brillant exposé. J'ai trois questions à poser. Donc la première question, on a parlé de deux fonds, 656 millions de dollars IS et une promesse de 200 millions de dollars. Je voudrais connaître la particularité de chaque fonds lié aux pertes et dommages. C'est la première question. La deuxième question, quels sont les critères d'éligibilité des pays africains à ces fonds de pertes et dommages et quelles sont les modalités d'accès à ces fonds? Est-ce que ce sont des prêts, des dons ou des subventions? Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. So, my français pas bien, mais my understanding is you asked two questions. Is the $600 million adequate? And what is the status of the access modalities for that $600 million? Yeah, c'est bon? Yeah, so my français c'est bien. Huh? So I'll ask the panelists to also respond to those questions. Can I have any indication? Okay, I'll take these two and then we'll have the panel respond and we'll wrap up. Please. Okay, three, no more. So yes, sir, and yourself, and then at the back there. So I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Here, Nchiko from Amnesty International, Climate Justice Advisor in Eastern Southern Africa. My question goes more to the IEPCC regarding epistemic justice. So what is really the problem? Is it that African scientists are not producing knowledge? Okay. I'm sorry about that. So I was saying my name is Nchiko from Amnesty International. I work as a climate justice advisor for East and Southern Africa. My question was going more to the IPCC, and it is to do with epistemic justice, because as we had, like, the contribution of African scientists in IPCC reports is somehow negligible. So my question is it that our scientists are not producing knowledge? Is it that we are producing knowledge, but then the publication platforms that we have are not recognized? And are there any plans at the IPCC level to try to resolve this issue? Because if we don't get the science right, that will have an impact on even the functionality of this loss and damage fund. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chico. So that's for the IPCC. Yes, the lady on that side and then the gentleman there. Apologies, I will not be taking any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Good morning, everyone. This is Suzanne Sensei. This is Suzanne Sensei from Cameroon, a young climate advocate. I'm here to represent the Environmental Protection and Development Association. So concerning the loss and damage, I would like to know, as far as the early warning systems are concerned, how are they going to be implemented? And equally, how are the people that are in remote areas, those who don't have access to internet, how are they going to have access to this? And I would also like to know, concerning the funds that will be allocated, is there any transparency process that is going to be implemented to ensure that the people that are affected, that there are really those that are affected that have access to this fund? Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much. And our final question from you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Tanda Godwin. My question goes to the first speaker and the last speaker. The first speaker talked about the role of governments in assessing loss and damage. And I want to ask, what is the role of the civil society? Because I see most governments are accompanied by the civil society in their actions, but he highlights solely the role of governments. And for the last speaker, he talked about establishing or putting in place national focal points for the access to the loss and damage funds. Can Africa do something different? This has been for adaptation fund, and the results are very, very little. And I speak for Cameroon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we have about 5 questions. The first is, what do we do about those losses and damages that we cannot quantify in monetary terms? As well as the issue of safeguards. How do we even avoid damages? Second question is about the adequacy of the 600 million and the access modalities. The third is an issue, the epistemological question, whose science is really defining what we are doing, and why is African science not recognized in the development of the narrative? And then the question about what safeguards and access modalities, particularly for marginalized communities. And from Cameroon, what is the role of civil society? So let's do the reverse order. I'll start with you, Edmund. Just respond to any of the questions very quickly, and then we'll move to the closing.
Okay, I'll try to respond to 2 questions. The lady in the front did ask a question as to what modalities are there in place in terms of non-economic loss and damage, and even extension of compensations to vulnerable people, indigenous people, and women. So part of the framework is that this group of vulnerable people are an important segment of the target areas in terms of beneficiaries of the disbursement of the fund. On the non-economic losses, the framework has made provision for disaster risk insurance as one of the intervention instruments, such that there will be compensations for parties that have been impacted by the impacts of climate change in terms of fiscal hazards, as the case may be. And even in articulating the framework to define who gets what and how, there's a piece around transparency. That's where the fund has a trustee. The fund also has the report or receives guidance from the COP itself, the Conference of Parties. The whole idea is to ensure that you don't have a fund that is hijacked and people don't really understand in terms of transparency how the allocation of the grants or direct interventions in terms of compensation for non-economic losses are addressed, so to speak. So vulnerable people, women, children, people that are less privileged in the society are critical focal points of beneficiary scope, are in the scope in terms of beneficiaries of the fund. I think the last speaker asked a question around the fact that the whole idea of focal points has not worked. And I agree with you, and in making my pre-submission, I'd also alluded to the fact that it's an all-stakeholder affair. So every country in Africa needs to sit together and look for the modalities that work. The most important thing is that in defining what your framework is as a country, there has to be representation of critical stakeholders that would be impacted in terms of implementation process, parties that will be there to ensure monitoring and evaluation of the disbursement of the fund, as the case may be. So I think there are still engagements that need to happen at the level of every country in terms of coming up with a framework that works for them to ensure that their countries or every country in Africa is well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities provided by the Loss and Damage Fund.
Thank you so much, James. I want to address myself to the question that was raised by Esther Mwaura. And Esther, I'm not Midika. Midika is seated on your right, on your left. But what I said is what Midika would have said. So basically, but you talked very well about, women's rights, to run. But I want to talk more about the vulnerability of women. In any climate calamity in any given region, the people that are affected mostly, of course, are women and children. Because arguably, men would go to urban centers to look for employment. Women would actually be left to look for water, to look for food, and so on and so forth. But there are also multiple levels of vulnerability. A woman seated somewhere in Washington would be affected differently from a woman seated in Nairobi. But a woman seated in Nairobi would be affected again differently, from the woman seated in Marsabit somewhere. So there are all these multiple levels of vulnerability. But we must make sure that climate, finance, especially loss and damage finance, is able to reach the most vulnerable in the communities. At the moment, some countries in Africa have not been able to access a single cent from GCF as it is now. So how are we going to make sure that we facilitate, of course, access to those funds? Connecting that with this question, whether 600 million is enough, I said 600 million should not even be mentioned, in the whole of this COP. It's an insult. One country is able to provide 100 billion to fund war in Israel and also, in Ukraine, and therefore we need to see serious financial pledges, but also not just pledges, but availing of resources. In terms of the issue of early warning systems, early warning systems are just there to tell us there will be a fund that are going to affect a certain region, in a certain particular time, so that we can prepare accordingly. But you see, this science is there. I want to give a simple example in my country. We knew El Nino was coming. In fact, our meteorological services, told us very well, El Nino is coming. And we were supposed to put some money aside. El Nino came finally, but now there's a discrepancy between the national government and county governments. And where is the money to fund or to support communities that are already affected? So early warning systems without resources to prepare for those particular challenges that are going to be experienced, cannot help us. Communities will be left vulnerable. They don't know where to move, even though it's going to be flooding in a certain particular region. Where do they move? So we may have this information, but without resources to prepare ourselves adequately, we may just be involving ourselves in just, some other kind of rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I heard? All right, thank you very much, colleagues. I will want to weigh in specifically on the IPCC question that was put to me about the Africa's scientists. Let me begin by saying that we have top-notch African scientists recognized globally. However, their piece of work doesn't get visibility. So it's a matter of visibility of the piece of work of our African scientists that's an issue. Not the science itself, not the people themselves. Why a lack of visibility? The IPCC categorizes source points for synthesis material in the catalog. And as James did mention, we have top-notch, high-impact scientific journals, which are actually picked for referencing of the IPCC authorship. And unfortunately, most of our Africa's works don't get there simply because of the cost implication. It is indeed pretty expensive to publish in those high-impact journals. Take a journal like Nature, for example. Now, it used some time to be at 2,000. Now it has gone up about 7 times more. So if you're talking about 15,000 US dollars to publish your article in Nature, against some many competing needs for the continent, you will find that the scientists will choose to publish in the lower affordable impact journals. That way, we begin missing out. So what's happening is that at the bureau level, we are trying to debate on how we could even accommodate Cray literature, as well as providing some dedicated funding for publishing of top-notch pieces of work which will contribute towards the knowledge base. So something is happening. Back at home through the AGN, we are also mobilizing resources to support top-notch scientific pieces of work. And if you are a publisher here, then get to know that there's a window which you can actually publish your work in the top high-impact scientific journals. That aside, I also want to comment on the role of the civil society. The civil society is not a parallel system, in my view. The civil society operates under a government structure. We have a legal and a policy framework that governs the civil society functions. And therefore, we must try to see how we integrate the civil society contribution into the governance mechanisms, especially of our climate funds. In case, I want to share the approach that we are piloting in Kenya and the financing locally led climate action, the FLOC approach, which of course means the government is only a custodian of the people's resource. And at the level of the national government, the county government level, they are only custodians. But the money is supposed to be spent at the lowest administrative unit, which is the ward level. And at the ward level, we have community leaders now who decide on what it is that they prioritize as an adaptation project. That is where the civil society actually connects directly because they are a people's mobilizer. So you have room, my sister, you have space to actively play a role at that level through the FLOCA process. If the L and the D is also going to borrow a leaf that cascades each funds down to the lowest level, where the most vulnerable are sitting, then we are likely to achieve a greater results in that way. Finally, there is this elusive question from my end over the land tenure. I think land tenure is a cultural issue. And our culture and heritage in the context of Africa should never be allowed to be polluted. In a family setting, a man is only a custodian of family resources. He's not an owner of the resource at all. And therefore, let's also be careful as we allow other cultures to infringe on our Africa setting, because there are no restrictions. You can't utilize land simply because you don't own it. Yeah, there are many ways of accessing land resource for use. So I'm not defending any school, but I'm saying we have a culture which we must be proud of as Africa. And it's that culture which, if we enhanced it, is what is going to form the basis of our adaptation. And that's why our indigenous and local knowledge systems then will find their way. We are giving it almost a chapter in the IPCC AR7 cycle, the indigenous and local knowledge system. So our African tradition over land, I think, will have to prevail. Thank you very much.
So let me be very, very brief, take 1 minute and respond to the thing. The question there, $3.8 trillion loss for the last 30 years, what is pledged doesn't make it. However, let's look at the positive side. It's a very good start, and it's a start in the right direction. On early warning systems, extreme weather events must not turn into a disaster, and I think that's the whole thing. The whole idea is, how do we reach last mile connectivity using digital solutions and other approaches? So early warning system is going to be cascaded from the continental to the regional and national levels and all the way to the communities. So I think. On the other side here, yes, this should be the responsibility of continental, regional, and national government institutions, but within the national government, private sector, and also the civil society should be an integral part. And to James, I think we all heard here, it is about time that we need to work on the methodological challenge and prospects and work together and really produce credible and data-driven report at the various regions, whether we take a REX-based approach or a country case studies. And I think let's make 2024 a year of action, and we can definitely support each other and be able to put together some credible documents which involve regional organizations, governments, countries, civil society, private sector, and put something out together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the whole panel. I think you'll appreciate that it is not easy to manage a panel of scientists, but I think I've done very well. So to conclude this session, I'm going to ask my sister, who is also the co-host of this particular event and the Director of Agriculture, Food Security and Environmental Sustainability at AUDA-NEPAD, my sister Estherine Fotabong. Please, you have the floor. Estherine will also have the last word, so after she has spoken, no one else can speak.
Just closing the meeting. Thank you, my brother James, for moderating such a fascinating conversation. I think it's afternoon now. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, I wasn't here in the beginning. We were stuck. It's not working? In another meeting, but my colleagues were here, and I think Mr. Opara did what was necessary to do the opening remarks. It's a difficult job I have to have 5 minutes or so to wrap such a rich conversation. And I think the last speaker, I want to join on what he said, that this reflection is just starting. So what I've heard the last few minutes I've been here and what I've been briefed by my colleagues, I think first of all, we should, I think, acknowledge and recognize that after 30 years on talking about the subject of loss and damage, in other words, if you use different terminologies before, compensation and all of that, at least we've arrived at the stage where there's a recognition that something has to be done. and now we have the fund that has been adopted. So that's good news. I like to see things half full rather than half empty. So that's good news. However, with that good news, of course, we are still far from getting there. Still very far from getting there. 4 big areas of issues relating to capitalization, relating to the governance of the fund, relating to the operationalization and accessibility of the fund, relating to monitoring and coordination. These are still big areas that needs to be sorted out. So, so far we have 650 million that has been pledged. But for this fund to become operational, we need 200 billion. So there is still a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to be done. And this very energetic and representative group has to continue that work, has to continue to talk about this, how to continue to put the pressure on the different actors so that this fund can be capitalized as soon as possible with that 200 billion so it becomes operational. I think that for me is a strong and clear message that I'm hearing from the conversation today. Collaboration and partnerships are key to building the capacities of member states to access the funds. The panel, again, just emphasized on the point. I think it's the colleague from Afreximbank that spoke about having project preparation capacity. And I think a strong collaboration with Afreximbank playing a very critical role in supporting member states in having this bankable programs is critical. Sometimes we pretend as if we have the capacity to do it. But we have seen from the experience of all the global funds that are there, that the ability of Africa to access this funding has been very, very limited. And it's not because of lack of good ideas. This room is full of brilliant ideas, and our member states have ideas on programs that should be able to access these funds, whether it's adaptation fund, or the Green Climate Fund, and so on. But the ability to just package them and bring the right ingredients is something that they need support with. And so we don't want the experience that we have had in these other funds to repeat itself with the loss and damage funds. So we have to be prepared. It's better warned. So we have to be prepared. We need to identify the critical players and actors in the continent that must support our member states as well as other actors to be able to access these resources. The third point is the one of governance. I've heard a lot about the question in the room. So who access these funds? Will it just be member states? Will civil society be able to access the funds directly? I think as part of the work that we need to do after here is to document the processes of other facilities and use that as evidence to make the case that we want to make in terms of accessibility of all the different actors. So if we take the GEF, when it started, we didn't have a window for non-state actors. But we now do have one. So I think we need to do our homework to document, to review and write about and bring out the lessons of all the other different funds that are there so that we can have concrete evidence to be able to make sure that the operationalization of the loss and damage fund is responsive of the desire of our communities. So, yes, the other point I would like to make hearing from everyone, I think, is connected to what I just said, the importance of science. The importance of science in terms of defining this methodology. We are not there yet. We need to do our homework. Again, we should not be caught off guard, or we should not be trying to, catch on. We should be in the leadership role, influencing the operational modalities of this fund. And to do that, again, we have to do our work. The science has to be done. ECA is there. They're doing brilliant work in terms of the science on climate change. I just mentioned Afrexim Bank in the sense of bankability, looking at criteria. We have PAJA. You've been talking about environmental and climate justice for so many years. So let's bring all of that in a very structured way with data so that we have a stronger voice in influencing the design and operationalization of this fund. So just wrapping up, listening to the conversation, those questions of what is loss and damage, what will be funded, came very clearly out of the conversation. So we must reflect on those questions. I think to date, I'm not sure that there's an official UN definition on that. So we have a space to be able to define what we want. Are we looking at historical loss, or are we looking at losses that just happen now? Because people don't want to look at the question of historical loss because you think it's compensation. But what is the difference? So that reflection, I think, as governments, as civil society, as academic institutions, as the development agency of the continent, we must continue to reflect on that and define what these things mean from an African perspective. Related to that, what is lost is what counts as loss and damage. The difference between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, and addressing loss and damage. I think my sister here, are we close? My sister made that point of, which I thought was a really interesting point, my sister from Kenya, that making the linkage between the loss and damage fund and our ability to adapt is something that we must think about, and how we use resources that we get from that. The question that I heard coming from the room is, yes, we now have a loss and damage fund that have been adopted. It's not been fully capitalized to get operational, but is that the only venue or avenue for getting resources to help us to address loss and damage that our communities are facing? I think we must reflect, continue to reflect on that. Are there other windows that we have to look and tap into? So, colleagues, it has been a great opportunity and a privilege to have all of you, for all of you to share your knowledge on this very important issue for the continent. And as AUDA-NEPAD and ECA, in collaboration with colleagues at Afrexim Bank, we want to sincerely thank you for being present here, and we say the conversation will continue with all of you so that we influence this fund so it responds to the need of African countries and communities. Thank you.